This is the executive order they said would never be signed. This is the phone call from the Treasury Department that made Iran's central bank governor realize his country's financial lifeline had just been severed. This is the moment when economic pressure transformed from diplomatic tool into existential weapon. Breaking developments from Washington and Tehran over the past 72 hours confirm what international relations experts have been warning about for weeks. The Trump administration has fundamentally changed the rules of economic engagement with Iran, and the consequences are rippling through global markets, Middle Eastern geopolitics, and the daily lives of 85 million Iranians. Tuesday afternoon, February 11, 2026, at 2:34 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the United States Department of the Treasury announced the most comprehensive expansion of sanctions against Iran since the 2018 withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The new measures target not just Iranian entities, but any financial institution, corporation, or government that continues to conduct business with Iran's petrochemical sector, its shipping industry, and its central banking system. We are talking about secondary sanctions that effectively force a choice: do business with Iran or do business with the United States. We are talking about asset freezes that have already locked down an estimated $7 billion in Iranian funds held in foreign banks. We are talking about economic isolation on a scale not seen since the sanctions regime against apartheid South Africa. This is not diplomatic posturing. This is not incremental policy adjustment. This is the weaponization of the global financial system to achieve foreign policy objectives that traditional military or diplomatic tools could not accomplish. And it is happening in real time with measurable consequences that are already devastating Iran's economy and forcing difficult calculations in capitals from Beijing to Brussels. To understand the magnitude of what changed this week, you need to understand the economic relationship between the United States and Iran over the past 2 decades. The hostility did not begin with Trump. It did not begin with the nuclear program. The roots go back to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, but the modern sanctions architecture was built during the Obama administration as a tool to force Iran to the negotiating table over its nuclear ambitions. Those sanctions worked. By 2015, Iran's economy was contracting, its currency had collapsed, oil exports, which account for 80% of Iran's export revenue, had been cut by more than half. The pain was severe enough that Iran's leadership agreed to the JCPOA, accepting strict limitations on nuclear enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. The agreement held from 2015 to 2018. European companies rushed back into Iran, oil exports recovered, the Iranian economy began growing again. But when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018, claiming the agreement was insufficient to prevent Iran from eventually developing nuclear weapons, the sanctions infrastructure was not just restored, but expanded dramatically. Between 2018 and 2024, U.S. sanctions policy toward Iran operated on a strategy called maximum pressure. The goal was to crater Iran's economy so severely that either the government would collapse or it would be forced to negotiate a new deal that addressed not just nuclear weapons, but also Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for proxy forces across the Middle East. The strategy produced mixed results. Iran's economy did contract significantly. The Iranian rial lost more than 60% of its value against the dollar. Inflation spiked above 40%. Unemployment increased, but the Iranian government did not collapse, and it refused to negotiate under what it characterized as economic blackmail. Instead, Iran responded asymmetrically with attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities, and escalating uranium enrichment beyond JCPOA limits. By late 2025, the situation had reached a dangerous equilibrium. Sanctions were hurting Iran but not changing its behavior. Iran was lashing out but not provoking a full military confrontation. The Trump administration facing domestic political pressures and international criticism for the humanitarian impact of sanctions on ordinary Iranians needed to either escalate or negotiate. This week's announcement represents the choice to escalate. What makes Tuesday's sanctions expansion different from previous measures is not the targeting of Iran itself. The United States has had comprehensive sanctions on Iran for years. What makes this different is the scope and severity of secondary sanctions designed to cut off Iran from the global financial system entirely. Secondary sanctions target third parties, foreign companies, and governments that continue to do business with Iran. The legal theory is that while the U.S. cannot directly control what non-American entities do, it can leverage access to the U.S. financial system and the American market as enforcement mechanism. If you are a European bank that processes transactions for an Iranian petrochemical company, the U.S. Treasury can designate you as facilitating sanctioned activity and cut you off from dollar clearing systems. Since the U.S. dollar is still the dominant global reserve currency and most international transactions clear through American financial institutions at some point, This is an existential threat to any bank. The Tuesday announcement designated 47 new entities as sanctioned under this framework. These include 14 Chinese companies involved in purchasing Iranian oil and reselling it in Asian markets, 8 shipping companies registered in Panama and Liberia that transport Iranian petroleum products, 11 European financial institutions accused of maintaining correspondent banking relationships with Iranian entities, 7 technology firms based in East Asia that sell dual-use equipment to Iran, 6 Middle Eastern trading companies that facilitate barter arrangements, allowing Iran to evade financial sanctions, Iran's central bank itself, which had previously been sanctioned but is now subject to additional measures that freeze any of its assets held in jurisdictions that cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. The Treasury Department announcement came with a 90-day wind-down period for existing contracts, but the message was unambiguous. Any entity that continues doing business with Iran after May 12, 2026 will face asset freezes, criminal penalties, and exclusion from U.S. markets. Within hours of the announcement, the effects were measurable. 3 major European banks suspended all Iran-related transactions. 2 Chinese state-owned oil companies announced they were reviewing their purchasing agreements. The Iranian rial fell 9% against the dollar in black market trading. The Tehran Stock Exchange dropped 6% in a single day. According to interviews with Treasury Department officials speaking on background to major news outlets, the decision to escalate at this particular moment was driven by intelligence assessments showing that Iran is now less than 6 months away from having sufficient enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon if it chooses to move forward with weaponization. The administration's calculation is that economic pain severe enough to threaten regime stability is the only remaining tool to prevent Iran from crossing that threshold without resorting to military strikes. The impact of Tuesday's sanctions is not theoretical. It is playing out in observable, measurable ways across Iran's economy and beyond. Let me walk through the specific mechanisms and their effects. First, Iran's oil exports, which had recovered to approximately 1.3 million barrels per day through sanctions evasion tactics, are now facing a complete shutdown. The Chinese companies that were purchasing Iranian oil despite U.S. sanctions have signaled they will comply with the new measures rather than risk losing access to American markets and financial systems. Iran's oil minister acknowledged in a statement Wednesday that exports could fall to near zero within 60 days. That is catastrophic for a government budget that depends on oil revenue for approximately 70% of its funding. Without oil export income, Iran cannot pay government salaries, cannot fund subsidy programs that keep food and fuel affordable for its population, and cannot finance the regional proxy networks in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen that are central to its strategic position. Second, the banking sanctions are having an immediate effect on Iran's ability to conduct any international commerce. Even countries that are sympathetic to Iran or opposed to U.S. sanctions policy cannot easily facilitate transactions when their banks face the choice between serving Iranian clients or maintaining access to the dollar-based international financial system. Reports from Tehran indicate that imports of essential goods, including pharmaceuticals and medical equipment that are theoretically exempt from sanctions, have slowed dramatically because payment mechanisms have broken down. Third, the currency collapse is accelerating. The Iranian rial was already weak, trading at approximately 500,000 rials to $1 US on the black market compared to an official rate of 285,000. In the 48 hours following the sanctions announcement, the black market rate spiked to 620,000 rials per dollar. For ordinary Iranians, this means the prices of imported goods, including many staple foods and all electronics, increased by more than 20% in 2 days. This is not abstract macroeconomic data. This is families unable to afford basic necessities. Fourth, foreign companies are fleeing. Any corporation with significant U.S. exposure cannot risk violating sanctions. European automakers, Asian electronics manufacturers, and Middle Eastern trading houses that had maintained business relationships with Iran are now terminating contracts and withdrawing from projects. The unemployment effects will be severe and immediate. The Iranian government has limited options to respond to this economic assault. It cannot print more money without triggering hyperinflation. It cannot borrow internationally because it is cut off from global capital markets. It cannot liquidate foreign currency reserves because most of those reserves are held in banks that are now complying with U.S. asset freezes. While the United States has the power to impose these sanctions unilaterally, the international response reveals deep divisions about the legitimacy and wisdom of weaponizing economic systems for geopolitical ends. The European Union has issued a strongly worded statement criticizing the sanctions expansion as counterproductive and harmful to diplomatic efforts to revive nuclear negotiations. France's foreign minister characterized the move as economic warfare that will harm the Iranian people without changing the government's behavior. Germany's chancellor expressed frustration that European companies are being forced to choose between Iran and the United States, calling it an abuse of American financial dominance. But European criticism has not translated into European defiance. Despite rhetorical opposition, European governments are enforcing U.S. sanctions because their financial institutions cannot operate without access to the dollar system. The European Union created a special purpose vehicle called Instex in 2019 specifically to allow trade with Iran outside the dollar system, but it has processed almost no transactions because European companies are too fearful of U.S. penalties to use it. China's response has been more strategically ambiguous. Chinese officials have condemned the sanctions as illegal unilateral coercion that violates international law. China has a strong interest in maintaining access to Iranian oil, and ideologically, Beijing opposes what it sees as American weaponization of economic interdependence. But China is also economically integrated with the United States to a degree that makes full defiance very costly. The Chinese companies that were designated in Tuesday's announcement have already begun complying, signaling that Beijing is not prepared to turn sanctions evasion into a systemic confrontation with Washington. Russia has positioned itself as Iran's economic lifeline, offering to increase bilateral trade conducted in rubles and rials rather than dollars, thereby circumventing U.S. sanctions. But Russia's economy is not large enough to replace the markets and financial services that Iran is losing access to. Russian support is symbolically important but practically insufficient to offset the damage. Middle Eastern reactions divide along sectarian and strategic lines. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, both rivals of Iran, have quietly welcomed the sanctions escalation, viewing it as a tool to constrain Iranian regional influence. Israel has been more vocal, with the prime minister stating that economic pressure is the only alternative to military action and praising the Trump administration's resolve. Meanwhile, countries like Iraq, which has close economic ties to Iran and a Shiite majority population with cultural and religious connections across the border, are caught in an impossible position. Iraq depends on Iranian electricity and natural gas to power its grid, but continued purchases now violate U.S. sanctions. Iraqi officials are pleading for waivers and exemptions, but the Treasury Department has signaled limited patience for special accommodations. One of the most controversial aspects of comprehensive sanctions is the humanitarian impact on civilian populations. While U.S. sanctions policy includes exemptions for food, medicine, and humanitarian goods, the reality of financial isolation makes it nearly impossible for Iran to import even exempt items. Reports from international humanitarian organizations operating in Iran describe a crisis developing across the healthcare system. Hospitals are running low on critical medications because pharmaceutical companies cannot receive payment for shipments. Cancer patients are unable to access chemotherapy drugs. Diabetics are struggling to find insulin, not because these items are sanctioned, but because the banking channels to pay for them have been severed. The Treasury Department disputes this characterization, arguing that humanitarian exemptions are clear and that Iran's government is choosing to prioritize military spending and support for proxy forces over the welfare of its own people. Officials point out that Iran continues to fund Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthi movement in Yemen, even as its citizens suffer from economic hardship. Both things can be true simultaneously. Iran's government does make strategic choices that prioritize regional influence over domestic welfare, and U.S. sanctions do create barriers to humanitarian trade that harm vulnerable populations regardless of exemptions on paper. The debate over responsibility does not change the reality that ordinary Iranians are experiencing severe economic hardship as a direct result of sanctions policy. Human rights organizations have documented increasing rates of malnutrition, infant mortality, and deaths from treatable diseases in Iran since 2018, when sanctions were reimposed. The Iranian government, which is authoritarian and repressive, uses this suffering as propaganda, blaming the United States for deliberately targeting civilians. The Trump administration counters that the Iranian regime could end the suffering immediately by complying with U.S. demands on nuclear weapons, missiles, and regional destabilization. This is the moral paradox of economic warfare. Unlike military strikes, sanctions do not kill people directly or immediately, but over time, through malnutrition, disease, and economic collapse, the cumulative toll can be devastating, and the people who suffer most are rarely the government officials making the strategic decisions that triggered the sanctions in the first place. Iran's government is not passive in this confrontation. Its leadership has developed sophisticated strategies to survive under sanctions and to impose costs on the United States and its allies for maintaining the pressure. The most immediate Iranian response to economic pressure has historically been asymmetric escalation. When sanctions tighten, Iran increases support for proxy forces, conducts harassment operations against commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf, and takes provocative steps in its nuclear program. The logic is clear. If the United States wants to make Iran's leaders uncomfortable economically, Iran will make American interests uncomfortable strategically. Within 36 hours of Tuesday's sanctions announcement, there were 3 significant incidents that intelligence analysts assess as Iranian responses. First, a drone attack on a U.S. military facility in Syria injured 4 American personnel. The attack was claimed by an Iraqi militia group, but U.S. intelligence assesses that the drones were Iranian-made, and the operation was coordinated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Second, 2 commercial oil tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz reported being approached and harassed by Iranian naval vessels, forcing them to alter course. Third, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization announced it was accelerating uranium enrichment at the Fordo facility, moving closer to weapons-grade levels. These are not coincidences. They are signals. Iran is demonstrating that it retains the capability to impose costs and create risks even under severe economic pressure. The calculation in Tehran is that if escalation is met with escalation, eventually the United States will conclude that the costs of sustaining maximum pressure outweigh the benefits and will seek an off-ramp through negotiation. Domestically, Iran's government has used sanctions as a tool for regime consolidation. By blaming external pressure for economic hardship, the regime deflects responsibility from its own mismanagement and corruption. Sanctions create a rally around the flag effect that can strengthen nationalist sentiment and make internal dissent appear unpatriotic. This dynamic is strongest immediately after sanctions are imposed, though over time, prolonged economic suffering can also fuel unrest. Iran has also developed significant sanctions evasion capabilities. Smuggling networks, front companies, ship-to-ship oil transfers in international waters, cryptocurrency transactions, and barter arrangements with sympathetic countries allow Iran to continue some level of economic activity despite official isolation. The Treasury Department estimates that Iran was evading approximately 40% of intended sanctions impact before Tuesday's announcement. The new measures are specifically designed to close those loopholes, but Iran will adapt with new evasion tactics. Behind the public confrontation, there are always quiet diplomatic channels exploring whether a negotiated resolution is possible. The question that matters is whether the Trump administration views sanctions as a tool to force Iran to the negotiating table or as an end in themselves designed to achieve regime change. Administration officials send mixed messages. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated in a press conference Wednesday that the door to diplomacy remains open if Iran is prepared to make serious commitments on nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and support for terrorism. But other officials speaking to reporters on background suggest the real goal is to make governance so difficult and expensive for the Iranian regime that it either collapses or fundamentally changes its strategic orientation. Iran's leadership has signaled willingness to negotiate, but only if sanctions are lifted first as a precondition. This creates a classic chicken and egg impasse. The United States demands behavioral changes before sanctions relief. Iran demands sanctions relief before behavioral changes. Neither side trusts the other enough to make the first concessive move. Intermediaries, including Oman, Qatar, and Switzerland, have attempted to facilitate indirect communications, but progress has been minimal. The Trump administration's position is that the pain Iran is experiencing is the point. Sanctions are working as intended by making it impossible for Iran to sustain current policies. Iran's position is that yielding to economic coercion would set a precedent that invites future pressure and demonstrates weakness that could destabilize the regime domestically. The most likely scenario, according to Middle East analysts, is that pressure continues to build until either Iran crosses a nuclear threshold that triggers military action or economic collapse becomes so severe that domestic unrest threatens regime survival and forces a strategic retreat. Neither outcome is imminent, but both are becoming more plausible with each sanctions escalation. The Iran sanctions are not happening in isolation. They are part of a broader shift in how major powers think about and use economic interdependence as a tool of statecraft. The United States has discovered that control over the global financial system provides leverage that can be as effective as military force in certain contexts and far less risky to deploy. But the weaponization of economic systems creates long-term risks that are not yet fully understood. When the United States uses access to dollar clearing as a coercive tool, it incentivizes other countries to develop alternative systems that reduce dependence on American financial infrastructure. China has been building a cross-border payment system called CIEPS, specifically to allow international transactions in renminbi without touching the dollar system. Russia has developed its own payment messaging system to replace SWIFT. The European Union has discussed creating a truly independent financial architecture. These alternatives are still far from replacing the dollar's dominance, but every time the United States weaponizes financial access, it accelerates the development of rival systems. Over decades, this could erode the structural power that makes current sanctions regimes effective. There is also a legitimacy question. When sanctions are imposed through the United Nations Security Council with international consensus, they carry global legitimacy. When one country imposes sanctions unilaterally and forces others to comply through secondary measures, it breeds resentment and resistance. The Europeans, who broadly agree that Iran should not have nuclear weapons, nonetheless deeply resent being forced to implement American policy choices through economic coercion. The precedent is also concerning for many countries. If the United States can use sanctions to attempt regime change in Iran, what stops it from using the same tools against other countries whose governments Washington dislikes? China, which has significant economic friction with the United States over trade, technology, and Taiwan, watches the Iran sanctions carefully and sees a preview of what comprehensive American economic warfare might look like. The situation that developed this week is inherently unstable and will evolve rapidly. There are several possible trajectories, each with dramatically different implications. Trajectory 1 is successful coercion. Iran's economy continues to deteriorate under the weight of comprehensive sanctions. Within 6 to 12 months, the economic pain becomes unbearable. The Iranian government, facing potential domestic unrest, agrees to negotiate seriously on nuclear weapons, missiles, and regional activities. A new deal is reached that addresses U.S. concerns. Sanctions are lifted. Crisis resolved. This is the Trump administration's preferred outcome, but most Iran specialists consider it the least likely scenario. Iran's regime has survived severe economic pressure before, and its decision-making is driven more by strategic and ideological factors than economic rationality. Trajectory 2 is Iranian capitulation through collapse. The sanctions create economic conditions so severe that the Iranian government loses the capacity to maintain control. Popular unrest, potentially combined with elite fracturing, leads to regime change. A new government comes to power that is more amenable to Western demands. This is the unstated goal of some administration hardliners, but it carries enormous risks. Regime collapse in Iran could create a power vacuum, civil war, refugee flows, and opportunities for extremist groups that would be far worse than the current situation. Trajectory 3 is military confrontation. Iran, facing existential economic pressure and running out of options, makes a strategic decision to provoke a crisis that it hopes will break the sanctions coalition, or at least demonstrate that pressure has costs. This could take the form of a major attack on Gulf shipping, a strike on Saudi or Israeli infrastructure, or acceleration of nuclear enrichment to weapons-grade levels. The United States responds militarily, and the conflict escalates into a broader regional war that disrupts global energy markets and kills thousands of people. Trajectory 4 is managed coexistence. Neither side achieves its maximal goals, but the situation stabilizes at a new, worse equilibrium. Iran learns to survive under comprehensive sanctions through evasion, support from China and Russia, and internal adaptation. The United States maintains pressure indefinitely, but does not achieve behavioral change or regime collapse. The humanitarian costs in Iran continue to mount, and the relationship remains hostile, but neither side is willing or able to force a resolution.